A man collapses in the streets, ignored by everyone, except for Shaquille O'Neal. But when Shaq helps him up, he doesn't just save a life. He steps into a war, a secret organization, a city built on corruption, and men who erase anyone who gets too close. Now, Shaq has a choice: walk away or bring the whole empire crashing down, and we already know what he chooses. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung high in the sky, its golden rays bouncing off the sleek black frame of Shaquille O'Neal's custom-built SUV. He had just stepped out, adjusting the sleeves of his tailored jacket, when the city around him reminded him exactly what it was: unforgiving. The sidewalks of downtown buzzed with their usual rhythm: businessmen rushing to late meetings, tourists snapping photos, vendors shouting deals. It was just another ordinary day. Until it wasn't. A sudden thud cracked through the air, a sound that didn't belong to the hum of city life. Shaq's head snapped in the direction of the noise. A man had fallen, hard, right onto the steaming concrete. For a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze. But only for Shaq. Everyone else, they barely spared a glance. A few passers-by slowed down, took in the sight: a frail, unwashed man, his clothes barely hanging onto his thin frame, his skin darkened by sun and struggle, and then walked on, uninterested, unaffected. Shaq's stomach twisted. He had seen people down on their luck before, but something about this moment felt wrong. He moved fast, his long strides closing the distance in seconds. As he crouched beside the man, he could hear the whispers. "Is that Shaquille O'Neal? Why's he helping that guy? Man, you can't help everybody." The man on the ground groaned, his chest rising and falling in jagged movements. His face was a map of exhaustion, cheekbones sharp, lips cracked, eyes fluttering under his lids. Sweat clung to his brow despite his shivers. Shaq's massive hand found the man's bony shoulder. "Hey, man, can you hear me?" No response, just a weak twitch of his fingers. Shaq scanned the sidewalk, expecting, hoping, someone else would step in. A doctor, a paramedic, anyone. But people only stole curious glances before slipping back into their own worlds. His gut told him this wasn't just some man who had skipped a meal or two. This was something deeper. And then he saw it. Poking out from beneath the tattered sleeve of the man's oversized jacket, ink, faded but distinct. A symbol, a jagged black marking, curling like a snake around his wrist. Shaq didn't recognize it, but something about it sent a shiver down his spine. Before he could think too much on it, the man gasped sharply, his eyelids peeling open. And the moment his eyes met Shaq's, everything shifted. Because this wasn't the look of a man who was simply sick or starving. This was the look of a man who was running from something, and he had just been caught. The man jolted upright so suddenly that Shaq nearly stepped back. His frail chest heaved, wild eyes darting in every direction. Then his gaze landed on Shaq again, and sheer terror bled into his features. "No, no, no, no," he rasped, voice barely more than sandpaper against wind. "You shouldn't have—" His body convulsed with a violent cough, but he still tried to push away from Shaq, scrambling backward on his elbows like a cornered animal. Shaq raised both palms, a universal sign of peace. "Hey, easy, man. I'm not here to hurt you." The man didn't seem to hear him. His hands fumbled against the concrete as if trying to dig into it, as if trying to disappear into the cracks. His lips trembled, forming words Shaq could barely hear. "They're coming." Shaq's brows knitted. "Who's coming?" Before the man could answer, a honk cut through the moment. A black sedan rolled up against the curb. Its windows were tinted, the kind of dark that was just a little too illegal. The kind that meant whoever was inside didn't want to be seen. Shaq followed the man's gaze to the car. The color drained from the man's face. "No," he whispered, his body nearly collapsing again. "Not yet. Please, not yet." The back window of the sedan inched down. Not all the way, just enough. And Shaq saw it. A pair of eyes. Cold. Calculating. Watching. The man on the ground let out a strangled whimper, gripping at Shaq's sleeve with surprising strength. "Please," he begged, "don't let them take me." Shaq's muscles tensed. He didn't know this man, didn't know his story. But what he did know, that car didn't belong to the good guys. A hand, large, well-manicured, appeared in the crack of the window, fingers tapping against the door. Not a word was spoken, but the message was clear. Stay out of this. Shaq had been around enough powerful men to know when he was being warned, but he had also been around enough predators to know when someone was being hunted. And he wasn't about to let that happen on his watch. Without breaking eye contact with the car, Shaq bent down, slipping an arm under the frail man's body. "All right, man, we're getting you out of here." The man gasped in relief, his weight barely registering against Shaq's strength. He turned, moving swiftly toward his SUV. The moment he did, the sedan's window rolled back up, and the tires screeched as the car peeled away from the curb. Shaq didn't watch it go, because something told him this wasn't the last time he'd see them. The drive was quiet, except for the occasional ragged breath from the man slumped in Shaq's passenger seat. Shaq had offered him water, food, even the shirt off his back, but the man barely responded. His fingers twitched every now and then, his lips moving as if whispering something to himself. Shaq stole a glance at him. "You gonna tell me your name?" The man's eyes flickered as if remembering where he was. He hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, "Victor." Shaq nodded. "All right, Victor, you want to tell me what that was all about back there?" Victor swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have helped me." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Man, I hear that a lot." Victor turned, desperation bleeding into his tired eyes. "No, you don't understand. You really shouldn't have helped me." He exhaled shakily. "Now they know you're involved." Shaq's grip tightened slightly on the wheel. "And who exactly is they?" Victor opened his mouth, then snapped it shut, eyes flicking to the side mirror. Shaq followed his gaze. A black sedan. Far behind them, but there. Shaq exhaled through his nose. "Well," he muttered under his breath, rolling his shoulders back. "Guess it's too late to back out now." And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. The familiar, unmistakable rush of a fight worth having. The tires hummed against the road as Shaquille O'Neal drove in silence, his gaze flicking between the street ahead and the man slumped against the leather seat beside him. He had driven through this city 1,000 times, but never with something like this sitting next to him. A human question mark, unraveling piece by piece. Victor, if that was even his real name, was still half-conscious, his body curled into itself. Limbs trembling like the warmth of the car was unfamiliar to him. The man had barely moved since Shaq had helped him into the SUV, his breath uneven, his fingers twitching against his lap as if expecting to be struck at any moment. The city outside moved on like nothing had happened, like people didn't collapse on sidewalks, like ghosts of forgotten men weren't hunted in broad daylight. Shaq tightened his grip on the wheel. He had no clue who Victor was. No clue why a car full of expensive silence had been watching him. But what he did know, his gut had never failed him before, and right now it was screaming. A rough gasp broke the quiet. Shaq turned just in time to see Victor bolt upright, his entire body jerking like he had been electrocuted. His chest rose and fell in erratic, panicked breaths, his wild eyes darting around the car like he had woken up in a nightmare. "No," Victor wheezed, his fingers clawing at the seatbelt like it was a noose. "No, no, no." Shaq raised a hand in a calming gesture. Hey, take it easy, man. You're safe." Victor flinched like the words physically hurt him. His hand scrambled against the car door like he was trying to pry it open, even though it wasn't locked. He twisted toward the window, eyes searching. No, scanning, like he expected to see something. Someone. Shaq frowned. Victor? The man flinched again, snapping his gaze to Shaq like he had forgotten he was even there. For a split second, there was pure terror in his expression, like he wasn't sure whether Shaq was friend or foe. Shaq kept his voice level, patient. You're safe. Victor's breath came out in shudders. No one is safe. Shaq exhaled, pressing his lips together. He had seen people in bad places before, had given out food, paid off bills, made sure struggling families didn't lose their homes. But this? This wasn't just a man who had fallen through the cracks. This was a man who had been pushed. A few beats of silence passed before Victor's body sagged back against the seat. His fingers curled around his own arms like he was trying to shrink into himself. Shaq reached toward the center console, grabbing the bottle of water he had set aside earlier. Here, drink something. Victor hesitated. His gaze flicked to the bottle, then to Shaq's face. For a moment it looked like he didn't understand the gesture, like he had never been given something without consequence. Shaq twisted the cap off and held it out. Come on, man, it's just water. Victor's fingers twitched. Then, cautiously, he reached out. The moment his skin brushed against Shaq's, he flinched hard, his body instinctively recoiling like he had been burned. His breath hitched, his eyes widening in a way that made something deep in Shaq's chest twist. How long had it been since this man had been touched without pain? Slowly, like he was waiting for Shaq to change his mind, Victor took the bottle. His fingers curled around the plastic, white-knuckled. He didn't drink it, just held it like it might disappear. Shaq let him have the moment. The car rolled to a stop at a red light. Shaq glanced out the window, scanning the street. No sign of the black sedan, but he knew better than to believe it was gone. Victor spoke, voice barely above a whisper. You shouldn't have helped me. Shaq turned back to him. Come again. Victor's grip on the bottle tightened. You shouldn't have helped me, he repeated, his voice thick with something between regret and fear. Now they'll come for you too. The light turned green. Shaq let the car move forward, but his mind stayed frozen in that moment. Victor's words replayed in his head. Now they'll come for you too. Shaq's jaw tensed. He had expected a story about a man who had lost everything, who had slipped through society's fingers. Maybe an addict, maybe someone struggling with mental health. But this? This was something else. He took a slow breath, keeping his tone careful. Who's they? Victor said nothing. Shaq glanced at him again. Victor's face was tight, his shoulders rigid. His gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, his body coiled like a spring. Victor, Shaq pressed, who are you running from? Victor's throat bobbed with a thick swallow. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost lost to the hum of the engine, You don't want to know. Shaq exhaled sharply. Brother, you just collapsed in the middle of the street, damn near scared to death. You're in my car now. So, yeah, I do want to know. Victor finally looked at him. Really looked at him. For a moment, something unreadable passed through his expression. He studied Shaq like he was searching for something, testing something. Then, slowly, carefully, he rolled up the tattered sleeve of his jacket. Shaq's gaze dropped. The tattoo. The same one he had noticed when Victor was lying on the pavement. Now, with a better look, Shaq could see it more clearly. It wasn't just some random design. It was a brand. Burned, inked, carved into the skin like a mark of ownership. And, next to it, just barely visible under years of scars and grime, 3 letters. Shaq's blood ran cold. He had seen those letters before, and he knew exactly what they meant. Victor's voice was barely more than a whisper. They don't let people leave. Shaq's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He did know those letters. He had heard about them on late-night news reports, buried beneath bigger headlines. He had read about them in articles that never gained enough traction, in testimonies that never made it past courtroom walls. He had even met someone once, a survivor, a woman whose voice shook as she described the things she had seen, the things she had barely escaped from. And now, sitting right next to him, was another one. A man who wasn't supposed to be free. A man who was running from the kind of people who made sure no one ran. The weight of it settled over Shaq like a heavy fog. He had thought this was just about helping someone in need, but now this was about survival. And for the first time in a long time, Shaq knew he wasn't just fighting to save someone. He was fighting to keep himself alive. Shaquille O'Neal had been in a lot of places. High-end restaurants, packed stadiums, private jets, late-night talk shows. He had shaken hands with presidents, laughed with billionaires, and walked through the brightest spots in the world. But now he sat in a no-name diner on the outskirts of a city that pretended not to notice men like Victor Haynes. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds like they were debating whether or not to give out. The cracked vinyl booth groaned under Shaq's weight as he leaned forward, arms on the table, watching Victor inhale his food like it might be his last meal. Maybe it was. Victor's hands shook as he lifted his fork, his eyes darting from the door to the window to the few tired souls sitting in the back of the diner. Every time the bell above the door jingled, his whole body tensed like he expected someone to walk in and put an end to whatever borrowed time he was living on. Shaq watched him, the pieces of this twisted puzzle still coming together in his mind. Victor Haynes, not just some random man down on his luck, not just another name lost in the cracks of a broken system. He was a survivor of something dark, something that wasn't supposed to have survivors. And now, because Shaq had helped him, something unseen had turned its gaze on both of them. The coffee in front of Shaq had gone cold, untouched. He had ordered it out of habit, but his appetite for anything other than answers had disappeared the second Victor had shown him the brand on his skin. "You need to tell me what I'm dealing with," Shaq said finally, keeping his voice steady. Victor didn't look up from his plate. He swallowed, exhaled, then wiped his mouth with a napkin that shook in his grasp. "They don't stop," he murmured. "They don't forgive." Shaq exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I figured that part out." Victor finally looked up, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion and something deeper, fear rooted so deep in his bones that it had reshaped him. "You don't get it," he whispered. "I was never supposed to leave. Nobody does." Shaq held his gaze. "Then how did you?" Victor swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against the table. "I ran," he admitted, "but not alone." His throat bobbed. "There was someone else, a woman. She didn't make it." Shaq's jaw tightened. He didn't press for more. Not yet. The bell above the diner door jingled. Victor flinched so hard he nearly knocked over his glass of water. Shaq instinctively shifted, placing himself between Victor and the door without making it obvious. He wasn't sure what he expected. A thug with a gun, a cop with the wrong orders, someone who looked like they belonged in the shadows. But the man who walked in, he was worse. He was tall, but not in a way that stood out. Well-dressed, but not in a way that demanded attention. Everything about him was intentional. From the way his polished shoes barely made a sound against the tile to the way his sharp, calculating eyes skimmed the room without really looking at anything. Except Victor. And then Shaq. The man didn't order anything. Didn't acknowledge the tired waitress behind the counter. He just stood there, loose and casual, like he had all the time in the world. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised a hand, and with a smirk, he dragged a single finger across his throat. A silent message. A warning. Leave it alone. Shaq leaned back, his expression unreadable. He had been around too many powerful men to be rattled by one standing in a diner acting like he owned the place. But Victor? Victor looked like he had already been buried. Shaq saw the way his hands curled into fists, how his entire body coiled like he was preparing for the inevitable. His breath had quickened, his shoulders hunched inward as if expecting a blow. Shaq exhaled slowly. He wasn't the kind of man who walked away from people who needed him, and he sure as hell wasn't going to start now. The man at the counter finally moved, reaching into his pocket. For a brief second, Shaq's instincts kicked into high gear, his body preparing to lunge. But the man didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a single business card. He placed it on the counter, tapping it twice with his knuckle. Then, without a word, he turned and strolled back outside. The sleek black car outside was still running, its tinted windows reflecting the diner's cheap neon lights. The door opened. The man slipped inside. And then, just as smoothly as it had arrived, the car pulled away. Victor let out a breath like he had been holding it for hours. Shaq reached for the card. There was no name on it. Just 3 letters, the same ones burned into Victor's skin. And a phone number. Victor's voice was hoarse. "Don't call it." Shaq turned the card over between his fingers. "What happens if I do?" Victor swallowed. "You won't like the answer." Shaq studied him, then slid the card into his pocket. "Guess I'll have to find out for myself." Victor paled. Shaq tossed a few bills onto the table and stood. "Come on," he said. "We're not staying here." Victor hesitated. "Where are we going?" Shaq pulled his hoodie up and pushed open the diner door, stepping into the crisp night air. "To get some real answers." The night was thick with tension, the city buzzing around them like a living thing. Shaquille O'Neal sat behind the wheel, gripping it just a little too tightly as he drove through the dimly lit back streets. The diner was behind them, but the weight of what had happened there still sat heavy in the air. Victor sat in the passenger seat, hunched over, arms wrapped around himself like he was trying to disappear. Shaq had seen a lot of people down on their luck, but this wasn't just a man struggling to survive. This was a man who had been hunted, a man who knew something. Shaq didn't speak for a while. He let the silence sit, let the hum of the engine and the distant wail of sirens fill the space. He wasn't in the habit of forcing people to talk, but this wasn't the kind of situation that allowed for patience. Victor must have felt it too, because eventually, with a long, shaky breath, he spoke. "I used to be someone," he murmured. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. Shaq kept his eyes on the road. "Still are." Victor let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. "Not the same way." He ran a hand through his dirty, matted hair. "I worked for powerful men, the kind you never see but who own everything around you." Shaq didn't react outwardly, but inside, something sharpened. He knew the type. He had spent years around people with influence, men who smiled in public but had hands stained with things they'd never be held accountable for. "What'd you do for them?" Victor hesitated, then exhaled. "Numbers, finances, legal loopholes. My job was to make sure their money moved quietly." Shaq's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Victor shook his head. "I wasn't a good man, Shaq. I played my part. I looked the other way." He let out a bitter laugh. "But then I saw something I wasn't supposed to." The temperature in the car seemed to drop a few degrees. Shaq finally glanced at him. "What'd you see?" Victor hesitated again. Then he shook his head, pressing his palms against his face. "Doesn't matter." Shaq's jaw ticked. "Seems like it does." Victor let out a breath, staring out the window as the streetlights blurred past. "I had a choice," he murmured. "Look away, pretend I didn't see it, or do the right thing." He swallowed hard. "I made the wrong choice." Shaq frowned. "Doing the right thing isn't the wrong choice." Victor let out a hollow chuckle. "It is when the people you're up against don't play by the rules." The weight of those words settled heavy between them. They reached an empty parking lot, the kind that had seen better days, the kind of place where streetlights flickered but didn't really light anything. Shaq pulled in and cut the engine. He turned to Victor, giving him his full attention. "What happened after that?" Victor stared at his hands. "They erased me." Shaq didn't blink. "My bank accounts? Gone. My credit score? Erased. My social security number? Doesn't exist." Victor laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that carried no joy. "My house? Burned to the ground. My family, His voice cracked just a little. "I don't know if they're even alive." Shaq's stomach twisted. "They took everything," Victor continued, voice hoarse. "And when I ran with nothing. No ID, no money, nothing to prove I was ever who I said I was." He exhaled sharply. "I thought if I could just disappear, maybe they'd leave me alone." Shaq leaned back against the seat, running a hand over his jaw. "But they didn't." Victor shook his head. "They don't let loose ends walk away." Shaq let those words sit for a moment. Then he let out a slow breath, his voice even. "And now, they've seen me with you." Victor flinched. Shaq didn't. He should have been scared. Any other man in his position might have been. But fear wasn't what settled in Shaq's chest. It was something else, something hotter. Rage. He had spent his life using his influence to help others, to fight back against injustices when he could. But this wasn't just about charity. This was personal. "You said you saw something," Shaq said, his voice steady. "Something that made them do all this." Victor hesitated again. Shaq exhaled. "Victor, if you don't tell me what this is really about, I can't help you." Victor's hands balled into fists in his lap. He looked down, then out the window, then finally, met Shaq's gaze. "There was a fund," he murmured. "Millions of dollars, but it wasn't charity, and it wasn't legal." His throat bobbed. "It was blood money. Money that shouldn't have existed, and I found out where it was going." Shaq didn't speak. Victor's voice was almost a whisper now. "They were buying people, Shaq. Cops, judges, senators." His breath hitched. "Every name I saw was a name that was supposed to be untouchable." The world around them suddenly felt much quieter. Victor swallowed. "I tried to leak it, to expose it." He let out a shuddering breath. "They got to me first." Shaq's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. "So what now?" Shaq asked, his voice controlled. "What's left?" Victor exhaled. "That list, it's still out there." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "And they think you still have it." Victor nodded slowly. The puzzle was coming together now. Shaq had stepped into something deep, and there was no walking away now. The air felt different, heavily charged. Shaq knew his name carried weight, knew he had the kind of influence that could shake things if he really wanted to. And maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. Victor ran a hand through his hair. "Shaq, you don't need to get involved in this." Shaq let out a low chuckle. "Bit late for that, don't you think?" Victor sighed, rubbing at his face. "If they find out you're helping me, they won't just let it slide." Shaq shrugged. "Let 'em try." Victor looked at him like he was insane. Shaq just turned the key in the ignition. "Where are we going?" Victor asked warily. Shaq shifted the car into drive. "To find that list." The first sign was subtle. A phone call from an unknown number, nothing but silence on the other end. Shaq almost ignored it. Almost. But then came the second call, and the third, and the fourth. Each time, the same thing. Silence. Not static, not a wrong number. Intentional. It didn't take long for the next sign to show up. When Shaq walked out of his downtown office, his car was waiting for him in its usual spot. But something was off. At first glance, it looked the same. Clean, polished, the kind of car that made people do double takes. Then he saw the scratches. Deep. Deliberate. A message carved into the metal with slow, controlled pressure. "Stay away." Shaq inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening. The city's elite had sent their first warning. He sent one back by not reacting at all. The next day, his phone buzzed with another unknown number. This time, there was a voice. "Shaq," a gruff tone murmured. "We need to talk. Now." Shaq frowned. "Who's this?" A heavy sigh. Malcolm Reed. Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. He hadn't heard that name in a long time. Malcolm was a former cop, the kind of man who had spent his career towing the line between justice and survival. He had seen the city for what it really was and had made his peace with it, or at least that's what Shaq had thought. "Where are you?" Shaq asked. "Somewhere safe," Malcolm replied. "But you're not." Shaq's gut tightened. "Meet me at Holland's garage. Midnight." The line went dead. Shaq exhaled, rubbing his temple. He had a feeling this conversation wasn't going to be a friendly one. Holland's garage wasn't exactly a welcoming place. It was one of those spots the city pretended didn't exist, tucked away in an industrial lot, surrounded by chain-link fences and the scent of oil and burnt rubber. Shaq parked and stepped out, his massive frame making the dimly lit space feel even smaller. Malcolm was already there, leaning against a rusted-out truck, cigarette dangling from his fingers. "You look like hell," Shaq muttered. Malcolm smirked. "And you look like a man who doesn't know when to quit." He crushed the cigarette beneath his boot. "Shaq, what the hell are you doing?" Shaq folded his arms. "Helping someone." Malcolm shook his head, letting out a low chuckle. "That's the problem, big man. You don't even know what you stepped into." Shaq's expression didn't change. "Then tell me." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "Victor Haynes ain't just some unlucky guy who crossed the wrong people. He's a loose end in a cover-up so big it makes the city's corruption look like child's play." Shaq didn't blink. "I figured as much." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Then you need to figure out something else. Walking away. These people don't throw punches in daylight. They don't make threats they don't follow through on, and they sure as hell don't like someone like you sniffing around." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Someone like me." Malcolm held his gaze. "Someone they can't buy." Silence stretched between them. Then Malcolm ran a hand down his face. "Look, I get it. You're Shaquille O'Neal. You don't scare easy. But these people, they don't care about your name, your money, or your reputation. They don't play fair." He leaned forward, voice low. "And if you keep pushing, they're going to do more than scratch up your damn car." Shaq exhaled slowly. "Then they better be ready for a fight." Malcolm groaned. "You really don't listen, do you?" Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the garage entrance, his instincts kicking in. Someone was watching them. The feeling wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Shaq had spent enough time around the kind of people who like to control things from the shadows. He knew when eyes were on him. Malcolm must have felt it too, because his posture shifted, his fingers inching toward his jacket pocket. "We got company." Shaq didn't turn his head, didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing he noticed. Instead, he exhaled and kept his voice even. "How bad?" Malcolm's eyes darted toward the far end of the lot. "3 of them. Been here since you pulled in. They're not the usual enforcers either. These guys, they're the cleanup crew." Shaq let out a low hum. "So they think I'm a mess that needs cleaning." Malcolm's face was tight. "That's exactly what they think." Shaq rolled his shoulders, then slowly turned, locking eyes with the men across the lot. Suits. Crisp. Expensive. The kind of men who didn't need to say anything to make their message clear. One of them took a slow step forward, hands in his pockets like he had all the time in the world. Shaq squared his stance. "You lost?" The man smirked. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Malcolm muttered under his breath. "This is bad." Shaq didn't look away. "Depends on how you define bad." The man chuckled. "Shaquille O'Neal, a man of great influence, a man who usually minds his own business." He tilted his head. "So tell me, why are you suddenly so interested in things that don't concern you?" Shaq's jaw flexed. "I don't like watching people get buried just because they stood on the wrong side of power." The man sighed, shaking his head. "That's unfortunate." Shaq lifted a brow. "For who?" The man just smiled. "For you." It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. Shaq knew what came next. The usual playbook. First, intimidation. Then, attempts at bribery. If those failed, The consequences got much worse. But the thing about Shaq, he had spent his life standing up to giants. He wasn't about to back down now. The man in the suit gave him a slow once-over, then flicked his gaze toward Malcolm. "I'd tell you to warn him, but I see you already tried." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "He doesn't listen." The man smirked. "That's a shame." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The other two followed. They didn't run, didn't threaten, didn't make a scene. They didn't have to. Shaq watched them leave, muscles tight with restraint. "That was a warning," Malcolm muttered, "and not the kind you ignore." Shaq nodded. "I know." Malcolm let out a bitter laugh. "Then why do I feel like you're about to do the exact opposite?" Shaq exhaled. "Because I am." Malcolm groaned. "You're going to get yourself killed." Shaq's eyes stayed on the spot where the men had stood. "Not before I find out who's really pulling the strings." Shaq thought he understood power, how it worked, how it moved, how it controlled. But this was something different. Because power wasn't just about money or influence, it was about control, about deciding who thrived, who suffered, and who simply disappeared. And Shaq had just pulled back the curtain on a secret that had been running this city for decades. It started with a name. Victor Haynes. Shaq knew Victor had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what exactly had he seen? What did these people want buried so badly? Shaq wasn't a detective, but he knew how to dig. And, more importantly, he had resources. So, he made some calls. First, to a few old friends in the media. No names, no details, just a simple question. "What do you know about Victor Haynes?" The responses came in slow at first. Then, one by one, they stopped. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left unread. The silence told Shaq everything. People were scared. That's when he called Malcolm. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Malcolm grumbled. Shaq ignored him. "Victor Haynes." What exactly did he see? A long sigh, a beat of hesitation, then something he wasn't supposed to. Which was? Another pause. "Ever heard of the Orion group?" Shaq frowned. "No." Malcolm let out a humorless chuckle. "Exactly, and that's how they like it. The Orion group. A name that didn't exist in newspapers, business directories, or police reports. No website, no board of trustees, nothing. But if you knew where to look, if you dug deep enough, you'd find whispers. Whispers about a private organization that operated in the shadows, made up of men from law enforcement, business, and government. The kind of men who pulled the city's strings without ever being seen. They weren't just rich. They decided who got to stay rich. They weren't just powerful. They decided who stayed in power. And Victor? He was just a janitor at a high-end investment firm. A nobody. Until the night he stayed late to clean an office he wasn't supposed to be in. Until he heard names he wasn't supposed to hear. Until he saw something. Something so dangerous that they erased his life overnight. Shaq leaned back in his chair, Malcolm's words rattling in his head. "So, what now?" Malcolm asked. Shaq exhaled. "Now, I find out what they're hiding." Malcolm groaned. "And then what?" Shaq's voice was quiet. "And then I burn it to the ground." The deeper Shaq dug, the darker it got. Victor's story was just one of many. A journalist who tried to investigate vanished 3 years ago. A young city councilman was found dead in his home under mysterious circumstances, after attempting to push an anti-corruption bill. A whistleblower died in a car accident, the day before testifying against a major real estate developer. Different people, different lives, but always the same pattern. Shaq tightened his grip on his phone. How many people had been buried for knowing too much? And how many more would be if he didn't stop it? That night, Shaq met Victor in a rundown motel off the highway. The man looked worse than before, hollowed out as if the fear was eating him from the inside. "They know you're helping me," Victor rasped, eyes darting around. "You have to stop, man. You don't understand who these people are." Shaq leaned against the table, his expression unreadable. "I understand just fine." Victor shook his head. "No, you don't." His voice cracked. "They don't just destroy you, they erase you. They make sure history forgets you even existed." Shaq didn't flinch. "Then I guess I'll have to make a lot of noise." Victor's breath hitched. "You can't win this fight." Shaq exhaled, his eyes locked on Victor's. "Maybe not. But I can damn sure make sure they don't win either." The next day, Shaq put his plan in motion. Step 1. Follow the money. He reached out to an old friend in finance, someone who specialized in tracing funds that weren't supposed to be traced. It took a few hours, but when the results came in, Shaq felt his stomach twist. Millions, billions, all funneled through shell companies, offshore accounts, and fake charities. And at the center of it, the Orion Group. Step 2. Find a crack in the armor. No system was perfect, no secret organization was invincible. Somewhere in their network, there was a weak link. Someone who wanted out. Shaq just had to find them. It took 2 days. And then, finally, a name. Martin Hale. A former city official who had disappeared from the public eye 6 months ago. Officially, he had retired. Unofficially, he had been silenced, but not completely. Shaq tracked him down to a cabin in the mountains, a place far from prying eyes. Martin answered the door looking like a man who hadn't slept in years. His hair was grayer, his hands shaky. But his eyes, they still held the weight of secrets too dangerous to keep. "You're wasting your time," Martin muttered. Shaq didn't budge. "Then why are your hands shaking?" Martin swallowed hard. A long pause. Then finally, he stepped aside. "Come in," he whispered. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and coffee gone stale. Martin sat heavily in a worn-out chair, rubbing his face. "If they find out I talked to you, I'm dead." Shaq leaned forward. "Then why are you talking to me?" Martin exhaled. "Because I'm already dead. At least this way it means something." Shaq stayed silent, letting the man gather his thoughts. Then Martin spoke, and the entire house of cards started to collapse. The Orion Group controlled everything: elections, courts, law enforcement. They had judges in their pockets, senators on their payroll, and a kill list for anyone who got in their way. Martin had been part of it. Until he tried to leave. Until he tried to expose them. That's when his life vanished overnight. Shaq listened, his jaw tight. "You can't win," Martin said, voice hollow. Shaq's eyes darkened. "I don't need to win." He leaned closer. "I just need to make sure the world sees them for what they really are." Martin's breath was unsteady. "You think exposing them will be enough?" Shaq didn't blink. "It's a start." That night, Shaq made his final call. Not to Malcolm. Not to his contacts in finance. To the press. He sent every document, every recording, every piece of evidence. He sent it to journalists who weren't afraid to ask dangerous questions. He sent it to government watchdogs, to people who had spent years trying to bring men like this down. And then, he waited. The next morning, the city woke up to chaos. Headlines screamed about the secret organization running their streets. News stations ran exposés on political corruption, money laundering, and murder disguised as accidents. And, at the center of it all, the Orion Group. They tried to deny it, tried to spin it, but the evidence was overwhelming. And suddenly, the men who thought they were untouchable were running scared. Shaq sat back, watching the fallout unfold. Victor, safe in a new city, called him that night. His voice cracked with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Shaq murmured. "Just live your life." Victor exhaled. "What about you?" Shaq glanced out the window, his gaze unreadable. "I think I just made some very powerful enemies." A pause. Then Victor chuckled softly. "Yeah," he said, "but I think you made a whole lot more friends." Shaq smiled. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think I did." The city had always been controlled from the shadows. Men in expensive suits made decisions over whiskey and cigar smoke, deciding who would rise, who would fall, and who would simply disappear. For decades, their power had been absolute, undeniable, untouchable, until now, until Shaquille O'Neal decided to take a stand. And when a giant stands, the whole city feels it. It started with a press leak. Not just any leak, the leak. Shaq had spent weeks gathering everything: hidden transactions, confidential emails, phone records that exposed the secret hand pulling the strings. But he knew something powerful men feared more than anything else: exposure. These weren't gangsters who settled scores with bullets. These were the kind of men who built their lives on secrecy. Their power came from operating in the dark. And so, Shaq flipped the lights on. The first story dropped at 6 a.m. By 6:15, it was trending. By 7:30, it was everywhere. Headlines screamed corruption. Journalists flooded the airwaves with breaking news. Secret bank accounts were exposed, political bribes were uncovered, and names, real names, were finally tied to the Orion group. The public? They lost their minds. The city that had spent decades looking the other way finally saw. And the men who thought they were untouchable. They panicked. By noon, everything was unraveling. Anonymous sources flooded in, confirming the worst. Former city officials suddenly remembered things they had forgotten. Even low-level operatives, men who had been the enforcers of silence, started talking. And once the floodgates opened, there was no stopping it. At 2 p.m., Malcolm called Shaq. "Jesus Christ, big man," Malcolm muttered, his voice tense. "What the hell did you do?" Shaq, sitting in his car outside a quiet diner, smiled faintly. "I told the truth. You just put half the city's elite on a kill list, man." Shaq exhaled. "Good. Then they can know what it feels like to be hunted." A pause. Then Malcolm let out a rough chuckle. "Damn, Shaq. Remind me to never piss you off." By 5 p.m., the black cars disappeared. For weeks, Shaq had seen them, parked outside his house, trailing him at a distance, their tinted windows hiding men who never showed their faces. But now, gone. The threats, the whispers, the unknown numbers that once buzzed his phone at odd hours? Silence, because the game had changed. The Orion group was powerful. But power means nothing when everyone is watching. When your enemies operate in the dark, the best thing you can do? Drag them into the light. And Shaq had done just that. By 7 p.m., the city trembled. News crews swarmed the police headquarters. Protesters flooded the streets. Elected officials, men who had once laughed at justice, suddenly found themselves hiding. The mayor resigned. A police commissioner was arrested. And the Orion group? For the first time in history, they were on the defensive. But Shaq knew better than to celebrate too soon. Because when you take power away from men like this, they don't go quietly. And before the night was over, he'd be reminded of that. At 9:30 p.m., Shaq's phone rang. It was Victor. His voice was shaking. "Shaq, I don't know what's happening, man. I think someone's been in my motel room." Shaq sat up. "Did you see anyone?" "No, but my stuff was moved. My bag was open. My phone was gone." Shaq's blood ran cold. The Orion group might have been running scared. But they weren't finished. Not yet. By 10 p.m., Shaq was back at the motel. Victor was pacing, hands running through his hair. His eyes were wild with fear. "Man, I should have never let you help me." Shaq placed a steady hand on Victor's shoulder. "You didn't let me do anything. I made a choice, and I don't regret it." Victor swallowed hard. "Then why do I feel like I just signed my death certificate?" Shaq's expression hardened. Because deep down, he knew Victor wasn't wrong. At 11 p.m., Shaq got another call. Malcolm again. This time his voice was different, shaken. "Shaq, listen to me. I don't know how, but they're moving fast. Faster than I expected. My sources are saying some of the guys you exposed, they're already out of the country. Shaq clenched his jaw. So, they're running. No, Malcolm said grimly. They're regrouping. Shaq felt his pulse tick higher. What are you saying, Malcolm? A long pause, then Malcolm's voice dropped. I'm saying they're coming for you. By midnight, the city held its breath. It was the calm before the storm. But Shaq had never feared storms, because when the storm comes, that's when giants rise. For men like Philip Graves, defeat is never an option. He had built his empire with the precision of a master strategist, planting his influence in every corner of the city. The courts, the police, the media, they all owed him, or at least they used to. Now, his kingdom was crumbling. His allies were scattering, and the man responsible? Shaquille O'Neal. A man who should have minded his business, a man who should have walked away, a man who, despite all the warnings, refused to bow. Philip Graves had faced challenges before, but never one like this. It started with the note. Shaq had barely been home for an hour when he noticed it, a small white envelope slipped under his front door. No threats, no dramatic warnings, just a single handwritten sentence. You may have won this battle, but wars never truly end. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. That all you got, Graves, he muttered under his breath, because threats, they didn't scare him, but unfinished business, that got his attention. Philip Graves didn't do rage. Rage was messy, uncontrolled. Weak men let their emotions guide them, but not him. He believed in precision, in control. And right now, he was losing both. He sat in his private study, the city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. A fire crackled in the grand fireplace, the warmth doing little to ease the cold realization settling into his bones. The world had shifted, and for the first time in 40 years, it had moved against him. The Orion group was fractured. Half its members were already out of the country, the other half scrambling for cover. The mayor had resigned, the police commissioner was under investigation, and the media, once his greatest weapon, had turned its cameras on him instead. And the worst part? One man had caused it all. Shaquille O'Neal, a retired basketball player, a public figure, an outsider who had no business meddling in things bigger than him. Yet here they were. And Graves, he wasn't done yet. Shaq wasn't naive. He knew men like Philip Graves didn't disappear quietly, which meant he had to end this the right way, and he already had a plan. But first, he needed to talk to someone. Malcolm Reed wasn't the type of man who rattled easily. He had been a cop for 30 years, seen the worst humanity had to offer, and lived to tell about it. But tonight, he looked rattled. "Shaq, listen to me," Malcolm said, voice low as he sat across from him at a near-empty cafe. "Graves ain't like the others. He doesn't scare, he doesn't run, and he sure as hell doesn't forgive." Shaq stirred his coffee, calm as ever. "Then we make sure he has nothing left to fight for." Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. "Man, you don't get it. He's got judges, businessmen, hell, even people in D.C. who owe him favors. You think he's going to let some bad press take him down?" Shaq leaned back. "Who said anything about bad press?" Malcolm frowned. "Then what are you planning?" Shaq smiled faintly. "A final move, one he won't see coming." And it was already in motion. Philip Graves had spent his life untouchable. No paper trails, no recorded conversations, nothing that could ever be tied back to him. But power breeds arrogance, and arrogance leaves cracks. Shaq had spent the last few weeks digging deep, finding people Graves had burned over the years, people who had once been loyal until they weren't. And once those people realized the king was falling, they talked. Emails surfaced, secret bank accounts, wire transfers linked to bribes, to fraudulent contracts, to every dirty deal Graves had ever touched. Shaq didn't just leak the files. He handed them over to the one agency even Graves couldn't buy off, the IRS, and within 24 hours, Philip Graves, the most powerful man in the city, was under federal investigation. For the first time in decades, Graves was on the defensive. The walls were closing in. His lawyers worked overtime, his remaining allies whispered in back rooms, scrambling for a way to keep him out of handcuffs. But Shaq knew the real way to break him. Because prison? That wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a man like Graves. Irrelevance was, and Shaq made sure the entire world watched as the empire crumbled. The once invisible puppeteer was now front-page news. His name dragged through headlines. His face plastered across every screen. He was no longer a king in the shadows. He was a fallen man under the spotlight. A week later, Shaq got another note. It was waiting on the hood of his car, written in the same familiar, neat handwriting. This time, it wasn't a threat. Just 2 words. "You won." Shaq read it twice, then chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Graves, I just made sure you never fight another war, because some demons refuse to die. But even demons can be buried." The city was quiet, not in the way that meant peace, but in the way that meant reset, like it was waiting to see who would rise from the ashes now that its king had fallen. Shaq sat at a small cafe, flipping open the day's newspaper. The headline stretched across the front page in bold, unforgiving letters. "Fall of a King. The Collapse of Philip Graves." The article went on about federal investigations, offshore accounts, powerful allies who had suddenly gone silent. Graves's name was everywhere. His empire? Gone. Shaq exhaled, setting the paper down. It was over, but the weight in his chest told him the truth. Nothing ever really ended. Victor Haynes was a free man again. For the first time in years, he had an identity, a bank account, a home. Shaq had made sure of that. He had called in every favor he had, pulled every string, made sure Victor's name was restored in every database that mattered. But fixing a man's record didn't mean fixing his life. Victor had spent years being hunted, running, surviving on scraps. And even now, sitting in a sunlit apartment with fresh clothes and a stocked fridge, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't real. "You did it," he had told Shaq just days ago, disbelief heavy in his voice. "You really took them down." Shaq had just shrugged. "Nah, man, you did. You survived." But Victor had shaken his head. "Surviving ain't the same as living. I gotta figure out how to do that again." Shaq had nodded because he understood. Victor had fought his war. Now he had to find his peace. Back at the cafe, Shaq took a slow sip of his coffee, watching the world move around him. The city was still the same. Fast, cold, detached. Pedestrians rushed past, taxis honked, businessmen checked their watches. Like nothing had ever happened. Like Philip Graves had never ruled. Like corruption had never tainted their streets. The city had a short memory. But some people remembered. The waitress set his bill on the table, pausing for a second. She was young, early 20s maybe, her brown hair tucked into a neat ponytail. "You're Shaquille O'Neal," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. Shaq smiled. "That's what they tell me." She glanced at the newspaper, her eyes flickering over the headline. Then she did something small, something most people wouldn't notice. She smiled, but not the polite kind. Not the customer service kind, the kind that meant something. "Thanks for what you did," she said, barely above a whisper. Shaq blinked. "And what's that?" She hesitated, then tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Making this place just a little bit better." Then she walked away, leaving Shaq with his coffee, his newspaper, and a realization. Not everyone forgets. Some people see, some people know, and sometimes that's enough. Malcolm Reed slid into the seat across from him, grumbling about city traffic. Man, you wouldn't believe how many people suddenly want to talk to me now that Graves is out of the picture. Shaq smirked. What? They finally realized you exist? Malcolm snorted. Something like that. Got a couple old friends in law enforcement saying things might actually change now. Some of the corrupt judges are under review, a few city officials stepping down. Shaq raised an eyebrow. So, you're saying we actually did something? Malcolm shrugged, stealing a sugar packet off the table. I'm saying you did something. Me? I'm just the guy who warned you to mind your business. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, and look how well I listened. Malcolm shook his head, but there was pride in his eyes. You know, you could have walked away. You didn't have to fight this fight. Shaq leaned back in his chair, glancing around at the bustling city. Yeah, but somebody had to. Because that's the thing about power. When it's unchecked, it thrives. When it's challenged, it fights. And when it's exposed, it falls. Shaq finished his coffee, left a tip big enough to make the waitress smile again, and stepped out into the street. The air was crisp, the city moving as fast as ever. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fixed, but it was better. And sometimes, that's enough. Some stories fade. Others spark something deeper. Truth has a way of surfacing when the right people refuse to stay silent. This city changed because one man made a choice. Now, the question is, who's next? Power isn't just in the hands of the elite. It's in the hands of those who dare to challenge them. The fight isn't over, and the next chapter, that's up to you.